Well, the tragic anniversary of October the 7th and the single worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust has just passed, with a worrying new poll suggesting that 61% of American Jews have experienced increased anti-Semitism following last year's attack by Hamas on Israel. Let's get reaction now from Jeff Ballabon, who is the Senior Counsel for International and Government Affairs at the American Center for Law and Justice. Jeff, really good to have you on the show. First of all, do these statistics surprise you?
Not in the least. I am just by personal background from a Holocaust survivor family on my mother's side. My father, British, and lived through the war in London, actually. But my mother's side was born in what was then Poland and now Ukraine, and she was born during the war. And I think I've always known that that while what happened then made it uncomfortable for much of Western civilization, it never pushed it away. And that October 7th was more of a sign that it's open season on Jews again, and that the not dormant, but the sub rosa anti-Semitism that has existed throughout was unleashed, unshackled. So, no, not really surprising, but indeed very frightening, not only for Jews, but for our civilization, Western civilization.
Well, indeed. I mean, major cities across Europe, including my hometown of London, on the evening of that appalling attack, people were driving around in their cars, beeping the horn and celebrating. Not thousands, but certainly hundreds, which I thought was truly, truly chilling.
Yes.
Israel seems to be the only country in the world that's not allowed to defend itself. Why?
Because Jews are the only people in the world who are not allowed to defend ourselves. And Israel is seen as an avatar for all things Jewish, and all Jews are seen as avatars for Israel. And so it's not just about Israeli policy, but now all Jews everywhere are considered, and for a long time this has been the case, been considered combatants and considered righteous targets. And so early on, people took to the streets calling gas the Jews, kill the Jews. Listen, we can't see right now, but I've been down. I wear a yarmulke, so I'm very visibly who I am in the streets and always have been. And that means my entire life. I've known this simply because when you walk around, and I don't wear this to reflect on anybody else. This is the way I was raised. This is my personal faith. It's my obedience to God. But it also means that my whole life I've known that we are targets.
It's so appalling. Does Israel have a case to answer for its actions in Gaza and more latterly Lebanon, or is this just war?
No, Israel is, if anything, is holding back. There is no country in existence who would have tolerated the attacks. There's no country in existence who would have tolerated what led up to the attacks, which is decades of bombings and terror attacks and killings, and then when finally Israel decided to unilaterally depart from Gaza, not because Israel doesn't have rights to be in Gaza. Israel, under international law, has rights to be in Gaza. There's a whole narrative that's changed, as though Israel is occupying. Israel's not an occupier of anything, right? Israel is a Jewish indigenous sovereign state for the Jewish indigenous homeland that was occupied and that has been liberated. And this is historically the case. And you don't have to go that far back. We've rewritten history to suggest that there was an indigenous Palestinian people. Palestinian, for centuries, described Jewish. Palestinian was literally meant the land of Israel, the Jewish homeland. And it was taken over in the 60s and created, and it actually is the definition of or the identifier for a genocidal death cult, not a nationality or a people. There was no Palestinian people prior to the 1960s. And so Israel has desperately tried to live in peace and coexistence. There are Israeli Arabs, right? 20% of the population are Arabs, most of them Muslim, some Christian. They are fighting in the IDF. This is their country that's been attacked as well. Even though it's a Jewish state, it is not only multi-ethnic and multicultural, it embraces this and it wants to live in peace and harmony with as many people in the world as it can. But this cult is dedicated to the eradication not only of Israel, but of all Jews everywhere. They acted on that on October 7th. From the north, Hezbollah has been acting on that throughout, rocketing cities. Israel has been acting with basically keeping itself shackled, and it needs to unshackle itself further to end this definitively.
And can I ask you about where this anti-Semitism is coming from? How much of it is fermented on campus now at US universities?
So at the American Center for Law and Justice, for decades, we've actually been representing, and all of our work is pro bono. We do this free of charge. We represent clients who are being, well, basically constitutional issues, many free speech issues, but many religious liberties issues. And so we have seen a great deal of discrimination against Jewish students, also against Christian students for a lot of reasons, but increasingly, and faculty, we see this discrimination, and it's become more and more overt anti-Semitism. So we've always known that these universities, and the more elite the university, the more progressive the university, the more deeply rooted and interwoven are these anti-Semitic messages. And again, I'm using anti-Semitism here. There is an internationally accepted definition of anti-Semitism. As you know, Jeremy Corbyn tried to change it. Yeah. And at that point, it became clear that he was actually trying to push to promote the idea that anti-Semitism should be okay if we call it a different name. Yeah. So people say anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. It all boils down to kill the Jews. That's all of these mean. And so we've known that this has been the case for a long time. And so now it's just become, again, October 7th just gave permission for people to make it public.
And can you tell me, Jeff, about so-called K-12 educational systems, education programs focusing on diversity and equity, which may be linked to this cult of anti-Semitism?
They are profoundly linked. That's correct. So there is a taxonomy of evil that is accepted as the underpinning of DEI, of diversity, equity, and the idea is that you are not judged by your behavior, not judged by what you do. You're not judged as an individual. You are assigned an identity by your birth inherently. And if you belong to a certain group, then you are either an oppressor or you're the oppressed. And while white Christians in America, white Christian males specifically, white Christian heterosexual males are the pinnacle of the oppressor, there is one footnote to that. There's a tiny little footnote, and that is the Jews are worse than that. And so the Jews are always the oppressor, and it doesn't matter what the Jews do, and therefore it doesn't matter what Israel does, and nor does it matter what is done to the Jews or Israel. Rape, sure, that's okay. They had it coming to them. Torture, murder, beheading of babies, burning them alive, sure, they had it coming to them. And the Israelis, I find, and I run ACLJ's office in Jerusalem as well, the Israelis don't understand it because they project their own decency and humanity onto populations that simply don't function that way. And they keep on thinking, well, we're very open and liberal and progressive in many ways, and we think that means accepting people. They don't understand that true DEI-style progressivism means rejecting people's right to exist based on who they are.
Now, the American Jewish community, Jeff, have traditionally supported the Democrats. They've traditionally been left-leaning. Do American Jews feel abandoned now by this party?
So I would say that it's a little bit more complex than that, and I've written much about this. Actually, the Jewish vote in America in presidential elections has been about 50-50 for quite a while. Okay. The problem is that all of the polling is being done by people who either have an agenda to say otherwise, and or are using lists that undercount or don't reach certain populations that are vast. So, for example, the Orthodox population, specifically what they call ultra-Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox don't care for that term. It's Haredi is the word they use, trembling before God. They are all but discounted in those polls. In fact, even population polls undercount them. At this point, they are close to 13% of the voting population. They're about 35% of Jews under the age of 18, maybe more. They have been voting Republican at the top of the ticket for quite a while. When it comes to local elections, they'll be voting based more on local issues, frequently which has to do with funding of institutions. So that's number one. Number two, a new study, which I can't reveal the numbers, a surprisingly large number of Israeli Americans, again, missed by the polls. Americans from the former Jews from the former Soviet Union, that's about 15% of the American Jewish population. They, by and large, are very independent, and they tend to vote more Republican than otherwise. So we're at the point of it's close to 50-50. The polls don't reflect that because they simply don't reach them. And I know I'm extending this, but that's number one. Number two, yes, there are many people who feel abandoned, but what the left has done is they've managed to say, well, yes, there's anti-Semitism here, but they distract by pointing to things and sort of creating the myth of anti-Semitism on the right. Now, the former chief rabbi of England, of the late
Jonathan Sachs.
the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Lord Jonathan Sachs, he did a spectacular speech on the floor of the House of Lords, which you may have seen, which he very quickly defines why anti-Semitism is a culture-destroying evil. They go after the Jews first, but then it always means the culture collapses. We've seen this over and over. Why it endangers Britain, but also what the three moments are that you see that it's a problem. One, it moves from the fringes of a political party to its mainstream. Well, that's clearly happened in one of the American parties, in the Democratic Party. Two, though the party sees it's not harmed by that. And three, those who object are vilified. Well, that's happened in the Democrat Party. What concerns me is that it's beginning to happen with the Republicans as well. It's still kept on the fringe, thank God. But we have to be very, very vigilant to keep it on the fringe, and then also work to push it on the fringe, not just in these parties, but in the political parties in Europe and in the UK as well.
Indeed. I understand the answer there in terms of whether the Jewish community is left-leaning or not is quite nuanced and complex, and it depends which American Jews you're talking about. But has an unlikely alliance started to begin to grow now between some US Jews and Donald Trump?
Yeah, I'm not sure why we would call it unlikely. I think it's very likely, and I think again, there's a direct ratio, and there was since 2016 in support for Donald Trump, and how often you attend religious services as a Jew, or how much Jewish education you have as a Jew. A tremendous direct. Your religious observance, your knowledge of Jewish history, your knowledge and awareness of current events, your frequency of travel to Israel. All of those things lead to increased voting for Republicans rather generally, and for Donald Trump specifically. I would say that's a survival mechanism. I would also argue, or just explain that, we understand in America that there used to be a very powerful Irish American vote. It doesn't really exist anymore because Irish Americans have largely assimilated to be non-minorities. However, there's still a forceful Catholic vote, many of whom are Irish. The problem with talking about the Jewish vote is that Jew means both Irish and Catholic. Right. Jew is both an ethnicity and a religion. And so the ethnic Jews who have assimilated, they're like the Irish, meaning they vote exactly the same way everyone in their zip code and their age bracket and income bracket and educational bracket vote. Those who, however, have this other separate concern, whether it's a Catholic concern, faith concern, a Jewish concern, they are voting increasingly and predominantly Republican and Trump.
Now, woke ideology seems to have infiltrated American public life. Its great public institutions, the media, corporations, and of course, academia. Is anti-Semitism now embedded in the DNA of woke ideology?
Oh, absolutely. It is part and parcel. And we discussed briefly DEI. It's part and parcel of woke ideology to identify the value and virtue and of a human being by their group entirely. There's nothing, actually nothing. There's nothing beyond that.
And critical race, so-called critical race theory doesn't protect Jews by the looks of it.
No. Jews have been. It's interesting because literally we have paperwork. When my grandfather, who was studying medicine in Vienna, was summarily, he finished his degree and they threw him out and they refused to give him a license, and they wrote because of his race. Well, he wasn't what? What wasn't? He wasn't white. He wasn't Aryan. I mean, he was a Jew. Jew was a race. Yeah. Okay. So when it was bad for us to not be white, we were not white. Now that it's bad for us to be white, we are white. The bottom line is the Jew hatred is different than other sort of hatreds. It's basically a big conspiracy theory that foments and has for literally millennia.
Can you remember a time in your life when Jewish Americans, have felt so unsafe in their own country?
No, absolutely not. I mean, in my life, I will tell you that this began, it was interesting to me, because I believe there's a lot of wisdom in what we'll call crowdsourcing as opposed to the experts. The base feels it, right? And when I started hearing American Jews beginning to talk about where do we run next, literally, is there a place to run next, was actually in around 6 or 7 months, or just a few months into Barack Obama's presidency.
Oh, really?
Yes, because what he was doing was, yeah, well, we began to see the race as a factor in value, and we began to see attacks on Jews. But again, it was beginning to sift down. And where did we? I heard this in Orthodox Jewish circles, mostly among older Jews who actually lived through the Holocaust, who came running from those places. And they were saying, and where do we run? Where do our children run? Or it's the end of our lives. Where are they going to run? And I will say that there really is nowhere to run, because if America falls, and it really has in some ways fallen, if it's not recaptured, so too the West. We see this in Western Europe as well. We see Central Europe has managed to maintain some sense, but most of Western Europe is really not. And it's dangerous to just be a Jew there.
Most definitely. Well, it's my view that Israel are currently fighting for the free world. We should be so grateful for what they're doing, their courage and the courage of their men and women, giving their lives for Western values, but they're getting brickbats for it. They're getting pushback. This hateful characterization of Jewish people in some circles as colonizers or even white supremacists.
So my family, my father's side is from London and had been there for a couple of centuries at least before the war. And my grandfather, he actually thought that England was going to turn against the Jews. And he thought that it was important, he didn't know whether to leave or not leave, but he felt that might happen. And indeed, I grew up on stories of the brown shirts and things that were happening, in the League of Fascists and possibly because of the war and the way it was waged, and because of Churchill, England stood firm, and England stood up for what was right, and England did prevail thanks to also America coming in and helping. And I agree with you 100%. Israel now it's standing in the breach for all of our culture. And I'll say something else. America really has been until now a beacon, because America was founded by people who actually came running from an older Europe where there was internecine warfare, where Christians killed Christians in the name of something else, and yet they called it Christianity. And my father tells a story, if you indulge me, and you can cut this if it's too long,
No.
that there was somebody in a synagogue in London that was always a very sad character. He remembers growing up because he had been in the First War. And the story was that in the trenches in France, he shot a German soldier, and the trenches were close enough that as the soldier lay dying, he heard the soldier say the Shema prayer, the holiest prayer that Jews say. We want to have it on our lips when we die. And so his whole life, he struggled with the fact that he killed another Jew, right? But my father's thought was, but what about all the other soldiers who are nominally Catholic killing Catholic or Christian killing Christian? And so Jews are a little bit different. We do feel more as a family than as a faith. But now America, it seems to me, was founded by people who consciously said there's an old pagan sort of Christian Europe, but we see a Judeo-Christian life, which is more tolerant, which is more Bible-based, and which stood for freedom. And that became a beacon to the world and a beacon to Western Europe also, Western civilization as well. And now I see people in America saying, these people didn't create America. Our white European forefathers. And the answer is, no, the people who came running from your forefathers did. Don't turn this into that war. This has been a beacon because it appreciates life and true tolerance and true religious liberties and true human and individual. We are all really created in God's image. That came from an America built by people who are conscious of the Bible. And as we've turned on that, every culture that turns on that, we see is collapsing. I'm sorry if that was too long.
No, it wasn't
and
too long.
It's not
it was compelling. And
by mistake.
It was important
that Israel stands in the breach.
Well, most definitely. I mean, it's my view that Jewish people are the most assimilated of any community, any race in history, frankly. I grew up in a school that was 40% Jewish intake, and you just couldn't hope for a more enlightened and assimilated Western value-based community, notwithstanding that these kids I went to school with had a different religion. I was Roman Catholic, they were Jewish, but we were in harmony. Can I ask you, is the media doing enough to call out this rampant anti-Semitism?
Well, it's interesting you ask today, because I've been getting a lot of calls lately that CBS News did some things maybe a little bit that are upsetting people. And one of my former jobs, I was the head of communications for CBS News. And so people are calling me to lament what CBS has done, which is that an interviewer dared challenge, again, one of the lions of woke progressive ideology, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote this scandalous book where, of course, Israel's at fault and Israel's worse than the terrorists. He doesn't mention that there was terrorism against Israel at all, as though Israel is out there trying to commit genocide. And he asked him some questions, and the head of CBS News president, apologized for the journalist asking those questions. So yes, that's just one example, and there are many more. The media have been absolutely not just complicit, but have led the charge in changing the narrative of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. And that is absolutely part of what's at play here.
Is what's happening within the Jewish community anti-Semitism on the rise? Is it going to have an impact on the outcome of the election in November?
That's a great question. Living where I do, where there's high concentrations of Jews and high concentrations of visible Jews, and again, I split my time actually between New York, largely, some Washington, and Jerusalem. And it's interesting how so many people here are nervous about the safety and security of Israelis, but the Israelis are very nervous about the safety and security of American Jews and Jews in Europe. They're very nervous about that, and rightfully so. So everyone's nervous about each other. But yes, it will play out in the elections because, thank God, I see the anti-Semitism because I live in those areas where there are heavy concentrations. But I also know that America, by and large, still has a good, decent electorate, and whether they are overtly religious or not, their baseline morality, certainly over the age of 35 or so, is still a Bible-based morality. It's still a morality where good is good and evil is evil, and there's very little confusion about that. And so a majority still see it. So the question is, how are they being communicated to? And I still have great hope and optimism that Americans still, by and large, not the youngest ones who've been infiltrated and influenced, it was Mein Kampf, right? Controls the youth, controls the future. That was the lesson that the left and the progressives have learned, and they've done that here. You mentioned K-12, but I still am hopeful that we can, with the strength of the backbone of moral, decent America, push back against it.
Jeff, it's been the greatest privilege to have you on the program. Jeff Ballabon is the Senior Counsel for International and Government Affairs at the American Center for Law and Justice. Jeff, more power to you. We'll catch up soon.
Amen. Thank you so much.